viewers, my name's Cara. This is my personal channel, CuteWitch772, and today we will be doing my book review of The Creative Tarot, A Modern Guide to an Inspired Life by Jessa Crispin, which I mentioned in my previous book review of a tarot-related book entitled It's All in the Cards. If you didn't see that, I will make sure to link it at the end of this video, in the description, in the little pop-up, whatever. But I mentioned this video at the end of that one, and at the time I was still partway through reading this. I have now finished reading it, and boy do I ever understand why numerous other tarot vloggers have talked about this book. I came across this book at my local library, which is why I decided to read it. And since then, every metaphysical store, every bookstore that I've been to, anywhere that carries information about tarot and divination, has this book, and for good reason. I love this book also because I am a creative person. I consider myself an artist of various things, various types. This book is about tarot from a creative point of view, and specifically using it to delve into a creative lifestyle. So let's get right into it. There is a nice introduction to this book. I am the kind of person who does read introductions, and I recommend reading introductions. I don't understand why people like to skip introductions of things. Other than that, they think, oh, it's just some background and whatever. I want to get to the story. I want to get to whatever's going on. I recommend always reading the introductions of things because sometimes it teaches you stuff that you need to know before you get into really the meat or the tofu, if you will, of what is going on, the body of the information that's going on. So this introduction is a bit about Jessa Crispin's background, which I think gives you a really good idea of where she's coming from and who her audience is intended to be for this book and how she's going to set everything up from here on in. It talks about what is the tarot, how do I use this book, and also some frequently asked questions, such as, is it okay for me to buy my own cards? Is tarot just about telling the future? And other important questions. How long does it take to learn the tarot? What if I'm a beginner? Which cards should I buy? Stuff like that. So definitely some good stuff in this introduction. And then there's a nice history of the tarot, which I learned some things in her history of the tarot here that I have never learned about tarot elsewhere. That doesn't mean this information isn't available elsewhere, because I, for sure, am not someone who's delved really deeply into every book that's ever been written about the tarot, like maybe some other people have. But for me, this was the first place that I encountered a lot of these little tidbits of information, which I felt really helped my view of the tarot and other systems related to it and how it developed and things like that. So I thought this was a really nice comprehensive look for people, even if you've been reading for a while but haven't gotten really super into it. One of the things throughout this book that I really appreciate is that the author goes through major categories at a time and tells you like what this means as a whole. For example, there's the major arcana. This is what the major arcana is as a whole. This is what the minor arcana is as a whole. And then swords, cups, wands, and coins as a suit. This is what they mean as a whole. Court cards, etc., which is something that I find lacking from a lot of, for example, little white books that come with tarot decks, and that's because that deck's little white book is just teaching you about that deck, not really tarot as a form. So these things can go more in depth with that, but I really appreciate that kind of thing within this book, and it's something that she does throughout. Then we get into the main body, which is the card by card. And there's always this kind of italicized section that is a little overview, and there is the Pamela Coleman Smith artwork, as well as the traditional name and associated number. But then there is an explanation of how that card fits into a creative lifestyle. And there are creative examples of people, artists, filmmakers, musicians, all kind of creative types, sculptors, things like that, who exemplify that card, which I think is fantastic, especially if you happen to know some of those people, know those references. It can really give you a different point of view. And for example, the Fool here is talking about, it's a bit like Mr. Magoo, the TV character. And there's also a French artist that is associated with it. And then at the end of each card section, Jessa Crispin, the author, has some recommended materials for delving more into the energy of that card. So for example, Tree of Paradise, a painting by Seraphine Lewis. Giant Steps, recording by John Coltrane. There's a list of things that go along with the Fool. And then same thing for the Magician here. There's talk of what the magician means in a creative aspect. Recommended materials include The Tempest, a play by William Shakespeare, The Juggler, a painting by Marc Chagall, and the paintings of Hilma af Klint. And it's always some kind of spectrum of things. So there will be like a painting that you can just Google and look at that painting. And then there will be like a whole play or a film or a sculpture, things like that. I loved that. And not that I went through and looked at each one of those things as I was going, but I just love that, especially if you own this book. I'm going to be returning this one to the library, but this is something that I might want to get a copy of in the future for that reason, that there's always that reference. And I did just really enjoy so much of what was going on. I put a bookmark in the section of the Card of Justice because justice and injustice are things that we're talking about so much in today's economic and political climate right now. And I really enjoyed the discussion of justice versus injustice and what justice represents and who justice is. And so, yeah, I bookmarked that, and I will be taking pictures of it to keep on my phone to keep reminding myself of this, because when I talk about justice on my channel in the future, some of what I want to talk about is from this book and the way that she talked about it. So I love it. Again, recommended materials, as with everything. So I'm going to skip ahead to the end, or I'm going to skip to the Minor Arcana, because this is how the Major Arcana is set up. So when we get to the Minor Arcana, again, I love this. So we have the Aces. Some books set it up like this, where you look at all of one card put together. Some do a suit at a time. So this book is set up with the entire number at a time. So we've got the Aces. This is what the Aces generally are. And then there's a 1 sentence, 2 sentence, little brief snippet. Ace of Swords, Cups, Wands, and Coins. Then they each get their own drawn out 2-page spread. It's usually about a 2-page spread, or 1.5 pages total for each one, depending on how it's laid out. Then we get into the twos. This is what the twos represent. Snippet, 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 and then each one gets their own spread, just like everything else. Loved that. I love that setup. That helps me so much. So if you're someone like me who likes to compare, what does the number 3 mean overall? And then break it up into how does it apply to each different thing, then this kind of setup is going to be great for you. You're really going to enjoy this. So props to the author on that. I love that. The court cards are handled in the same manner. This is all the knights. Snippet, 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 snippet. Although the snippets are a little bit longer than for the other ones. For the aces, for example, because aces are very, kind of straightforward, especially as far as this author's interpretation goes, which I agree with. I think it's awesome. And so again, lists of recommended materials for every single one. And then I really appreciated, this is something that I talked about in my review of the previous book, that I wished there was a difference laid out between what the queens represent versus what the kings represent, instead of just these are what the queens and kings represent and the only major difference is the masculine versus feminine side of the energy. This book lays it out. This is what the queens are. And this first thing, so for people who are wondering that like me, Jessa Crispin says it right here. The queens, more than just about anything else, feel. They love, they desire, they weep, they laugh. Even when they are thinking about something, they are feeling it too. Which is not to say the queens are passive. So I loved that. That helped me so much, because that distinction is something that I was lacking within things I was reading about tarot. I mean, there are always things that you can come up with as your own meaning for these things, but this is the first time I had really seen it written, especially in a book. So again, just saying, that's the first time I've encountered it in a book. I'm glad it was this book. I loved it. I love it. I love it. So thank you, Jessa Crispin, for that. And again, recommended materials for every single one. And then we have the kings, of course, same deal. So after we get through all of that, major and minor arcana, court cards and everything, we have a little bit about the spreads. And the one thing that I would say is lacking from this is that there are no graphic representations of how to lay out the cards. It just gives you a miniature description of what this spread is. For example, for Finding Inspiration, this is a 3-card reading. This is a little italicized explanation of what it is. So again, it's like these are the overview, snippet, 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 snippet of these spreads. Then each of those spreads gets its own full page spread describing it and then each one also has a sample reading. But it'll just say the head, heart, body. It doesn't give you a graphic representation of how to lay out the cards, which I will say is something that I felt like was missing, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily bad. I don't think that's necessarily a con, because this is the Creative Tarot. This is a book about being creative. So in a way, that's a challenge for you to use your intuition and start to be creative and say, okay, well, she gave me these 3 cards and she told me what they represent. How do I feel they should be set up? Because you could come up with a million different ways. So when I was first looking through it, I was looking for that graphic representation of how to lay them out. I think because that's what we expect, because that's what everyone else does. But again, I don't think it's bad. I think it's just a challenge to start to be creative, or not even a challenge, but an opportunity to start to be creative with this work. So yeah, I'll leave it up to you whether you think that's a pro or a con, but that is a thing that I noticed about this book. I also want to say that these sample readings are freaking amazing. There was one sample reading in here which, when I read it, was like exactly what was going on in my life at that given moment, and I was floored by the fact that a sample reading in a book that was published years ago, actually not that long ago, this is copyright 2016, but still, a book that was published over a year ago, a pre-printed sample reading in a pre-published book could fit my life so closely that it told me what I needed to do that day in that moment. So, again, props to Jessa Crispin. I love this book, man. And I will say also, I have seen a million people on YouTube do reviews of this book. I have not watched any of them, so this is my opinion, unadulterated by anyone else's opinion. But I just wager that a lot of them also have a really high opinion of this book. And I'll probably go watch some of my favorite people and their reviews of it after this, just to see what they thought, if they picked up on anything different than what I did. And then there's some information here in the end about how to do a reading. And again, there's humor within this book, and she's definitely set it up for people who want to learn. People who just are creative and want to learn how to incorporate this into their own practice. So for example, how to do a reading, the setup. First, you need a large crystal of smoky quartz and some sage for cleansing. Kidding! I'm only kidding. If you're the type of person who needs a ritualistic setting to focus, go for it. Blah, blah, blah. But you don't need the whole witchy apparatus if the witchy apparatus does not speak to you. Ha! Perfect. I love this. This is the way I teach, so I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the humor. I think writing the way you would speak and make jokes and things like that is something that I really appreciate personally, just as a human being. Information, suggestions on getting to know your cards, how to choose a deck. So again, looking at some more of those frequently asked questions, revisiting them in the end. And then there's also a section on finding the patterns, which is something that I started doing within my readings over the years that I don't always see people do. If you've ever gotten a reading from me, which the link is always in the description of my videos, so it's down in the description below. There's a link to the page on my blog. If you have gotten a reading from me before in the past, you will know that at the end of the reading, I tend to do a little overview, and that's where I will say if there's any major pattern that I noticed. For example, if your reading is heavy on swords, heavy on cups, or if it's light on swords or missing them entirely, it could mean this. If it's light on cups, example. So this is going through all that. And then numbers. If you find runs of numbers, if you find, you have all 4 of the 2s, if you have all of something, or if you are lacking any even numbers, I don't know, that's never happened for me, but that's something that could come up that would be really noticeable. And then she talks about the form of reading, which is telling a story, using the cards laid out in front of you to tell the story of what's going on in those cards, and then how do you take that story and relate it to your life. This is just how any of us maybe read a folklore, a folktale, a legend, watch a movie, and just see what that story is saying, and then discover how it relates to our lives personally. So there's a little bit of talk about that, how to read for someone else. And a conclusion, just a little conclusion. What happens next is up to you. Spoiler, that's the last sentence. Oh, I also somehow managed to flip past it. In the middle of the book, there are some colored pages showing some of the collage art cards that are from the deck that was created by the author. So these are pretty nifty. It shows all of the knights, and I especially thought it was cool because some of them are very traditional. There's traditional elements within the collages. Some of them are very non-traditional, but then especially as you read through what her interpretations are of the cards and think of it in more creative styles, you definitely get to see some cool, different some different things going on, and I really like it. So, it's very interesting art. There are, some choices I agree with, some choices that I don't agree with as much, but I love it in the fact that it's creative and it's something new, and I just really like how the knights look all together, so I keep coming back to that spread. But this is all the queens. So yeah, so there's a few examples of that if you're interested in getting the deck that she created as well. So all of the props to Jessa Crispin. Thank you so much for creating this book. I found it immensely helpful, and I will probably seek to purchase my own copy sometime in the future. In the meantime, thank you to the public library system for making things available. If you do not already, please utilize your public library systems. They are so important to people in helping us access information that we may not be able to afford buying. People can use the internet there for so many different things without having to worry about it at home and having all the technology. They're really immensely helpful, so big ups to the public library system as well. Thank you so much for watching this review. I hope you found it entertaining/helpful, and if this book seemed interesting to you, I do hope you will check it out. I found it awesome, obviously. So yeah, I'll see you next time, and until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye!